Dr. Blumstein is highly prolific and has published numerous journal articles, kind of hard to count all of them, popular media publications, and books. I think he's going to mention one of his books today, his latest one, The Nature of Fear, Survival Lessons from the Wild. Dr. Blumstein has also made many contributions to conservation planning and has been a mentor to many graduate students, undergraduate students, and postdocs. We're really thrilled to have Dan here today with the spirit of EIS being bringing together different disciplines, because Dan's really done that a lot through his career. He's integrated various disciplines, including conservation biology, behavioral ecology, and the evolution of behavior. And a lot of his research has been, he really summed it up well last night. He likes to scare stuff a lot. Last night at dinner, he mentioned that. So he's worked a lot with marmots, has been a long-term study, the evolution of behavior and communication, but he's studied across a wide group of taxonomic groups. And today I think he's going to mention a lot of them in his talk. So everybody, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Dan Blumstein.
Thank you. I'm going to apologize because I'm the one who's going to be coughing. I managed to get a cold. Who's been sick in the last 2.5 years? But thank you so much for having me here. And if I can croak through this one, it'll be great. I want to take you on a journey today that is really designed to get people thinking. I mean, I can talk about any of these, studies in more detail if you wish, but really it's to sort of illustrate an approach. And as Griffin said, I'm really inspired by bringing different fields together. And what I want to do is sort of illustrate a conservation behavior approach to thinking about how one integrates behavior into conservation. Traditional wildlife research, I would say, or I'm going to call this translational wildlife research rather. And I'm going to model it off the NIH's from the bench to the bedside idea, where you think about doing biomedical research that has clear human health benefits. So in a non-human system context, we're doing research that takes fundamental insights from behavioral biology and ultimately applies them to both wildlife conservation and management. A theme is mechanisms, a mechanistic study. And these mechanistic studies give us levers that allow us to predict responses to humans. And these could be to ecotourists, or these could be to a variety of other conservation problems. Recently, and I'm not really going to talk about this much more than this, with Alison Greger and Oded Berger-Tal, we sort of realized that many wildlife management problems can be framed as attract-repel questions. You want to attract animals to locations where they're safe. You want to repel them from other locations. You want to attract them to wildlife crossings, keep them away from other things. You want to repel them from, bears in your dumpsters outside your house, et cetera. So we developed a decision support tool and then really developed a theory of cognitive wildlife management, where we think about perception and learning and various cognitive traits that are important in thinking about wildlife management. I'm not talking about that today as much as other things. I will say that everything I'm talking about is meant to be both inspirational, but you should be critical. And really, what we do is we need to think about, and conservation needs to sort of employ evidence-based decision-making. And this really means, we're going to do adaptive management. Active adaptive management, as many of you know, is where you go out and you do an experiment and try to figure out what works and what doesn't work, and then you sort of tool with it to improve things. With endangered species, often managers aren't in the position to sort of have a control experiment or a control population, because whatever you've been doing isn't working, and if the species is going extinct, you don't have the degrees of freedom to work with. So in many cases, people do passive adaptive management. Well, I would say adaptive management is sort of a rallying cry behind a lot of conservation research. It's rare that it's really done in the ways that it should be. Nonetheless, I want to talk about a lot of things today. So all of these ideas I'm going to be talking about are ideas that in any given context, if you were to apply them, you would want to sort of set it up as an experiment and conduct an adaptive management experiment. I'm going to talk about flight initiation distance, which I do a lot of, as a metric to quantify disturbance. I'm going to talk about the evolutionary ecology of fear. Why, when you put a hiking trail in a place, do you start losing species? What's that about? Why do some species tolerate humans and others not? Where do animals feel safe? How do we get insights into sort of security? I'm going to talk about anthropogenic noise and something I call the distracted prey hypothesis. I want to talk about habituation and something, and really the natural history of habituation. We've habituation is an idea that's been out there for over 100 years, and psychologists have studied it. Yet, understanding the evolution of it is sort of lags behind. And I'm going to propose the contiguous habitat hypothesis. And I want to talk about the multi-predator hypothesis and the evolutionary persistence of behavior in several different contexts. So why anti-predator behavior? What is anti-predator behavior? Anti-predator behavior are things animals do to reduce the probability of being detected by a predator, attacked by a predator, and ultimately killed by a predator. It includes a suite of adaptations to detect predators, to identify them. Anti-predator vigilance is often important, to escape from predators, flee them, use refugia, and also to communicate about them. And in my career, I've looked at a lot of those sorts of questions. Why study anti-predator behavior? Well, getting killed really is a bummer, and it decreases your direct fitness. So there are direct effects of predation on populations and communities. Predation is a very strong selective force. And while I said I'm not really talking about marmots today, in our long-term study of marmots, locations where marmots live that have good visibility and protective rocks are those locations that don't go periodically extinct. We've been studying these marmots for 60 years at one location, and I think these analyses were based on 40-some years of data. So it's not food, it's actually security that influences population persistence, at least for the marmots we work with. There are also a suite of indirect effects of predation on populations and communities. Fear alone can influence where animals go and what they do. Fear may structure communities. And the nature of fear, I talk about a lot of things with fear. I think last night I said, I scare shit. What do? I scare shit. But I try to learn from it. And I think that from a context of wildlife management and particularly conservation science, predation is often the cause of wildlife management failures. You translocate a population or you translocate individuals to recover a population or reintroduce them. Most of these animals die. And that's a huge problem. It's an ethical problem, but it's also a practical problem. And it ends up costing a lot of money. So I think that for a variety of reasons, we can use anti-predator behavior as one way to think about the integration of behavior and conservation and management. So we know that humans change animals' behavior. This is an Australian pelican. They're about the size of a small Cessna. We could walk right up to these animals. And a key to understanding how humans impact animals is to sort of ask them. Predators approach animals, animals flee. We approach animals, animals flee. So I'm not asserting that they flee in the same ways or the same dynamics with predators and non-predators. Those are really important questions that one has to ask empirically, but I'm going to say that this gives you the ability to come up with a comparative data set for lots of species and then beginning looking at the evolution of these things. So, why do some species tolerate disturbance? I started this work with birds because there are a lot of different birds. They have a lot of different life histories. They have a lot of different natural histories. Most are diurnal, and you can get big data sets. And what I was using was this idea of flight initiation distance at which an individual flees when you're approaching it. It's a method to quantify the perception of predation risk, and it's a method I believe that can aid in wildlife management. Initially, I developed a comparative data set with about 10,000 flushes and about 300 species of birds. I started the work in Australia. It's biased towards Australian and Western birds, mostly Californian, some in Colorado. But this work inspired lots of other people, and now I collaborate with many people. I don't know what the current head count of scared birds is, but it's sort of become an industry out there. And we collectively have scared things all over the world and are doing all sorts of interesting global studies on fear. We know that flight initiation distance is species specific. And by the way, these flight initiation distances, decision animals make. These decisions are economic decisions, as I'll say in a moment. But there is a species specific component to this. So early on, I looked at a bunch of birds in Sydney around Botany Bay, where the airport is, and typically what you see is at these different sites, the flighty birds typically have relatively high flight initiation distances. The tolerant birds that you let you get close to them typically are on the low end. There are some interactions and some crosses, but at the end of the day, there's something there about the flightiness of a species to work with. Larger birds detect approaching humans at a greater distance. Larger birds also flush at a greater distance. So this sort of let me initially think, so when you're trying to do conservation behavior, you have to have a conservation problem. Can you develop a setback zone? How close can you get to birds without disturbing them? How far do you have to put parking lots away from, maybe particularly important habitat or whatever? So initially I was thinking, well, large birds are those that are going to be most impacted by humans. Is that true or not? Meta-analysis, of course, is a very important tool to begin pulling together results from many different studies and to estimate the effect size of various things. Meta-analyses calculate weighted effect sizes from many studies. I have no hair because I pulled most of it out being involved in various meta-analyses, because when you actually go and look at the literature, you realize that people don't report enough information, like what the sample size was, in order for you to calculate things. Let that be a warning to you, always report the sample size. But more importantly, meta-analyses, in addition to allowing you to quantify the effect size of a given hypothesis, also allows you to calculate what are called heterogeneity statistics that allow you to look for sort of different clumps of species. So for example, in this initial meta-analysis that Ted Stankiewicz and I did for a bunch of different taxa, fish, but not other taxa, tolerated closer approaches as group size increased. So why might fish tolerate closer approaches, group size increases? Well, maybe there's a collective defense. So once you start thinking about that, you say, well, what other species engage in collective defenses? Muskox. So I was trying to get, Joel Berger, when he was studying muskox, to, flush them and sort of look for this hypothesis, but he didn't take that one up. Over the years, I and others have done a variety of meta-analyses on a variety of taxa. I was editing a book with Bill Cooper, and we invited Anders Moeller to do one on birds. Flight initiation distance decreases with urbanization, increases with body mass, FID varies with predation risk, decreases with latitude. The latitude effect is kind of interesting. Decreases with sociality. And these are in order. We're using R as a measure of effect size. So these are in order of their effect size. Decreases with parasitism. So parasized animals let you get closer to them, birds at least. Increases with hunting, as it should. There are also a suite of life history effects and habitat openness effects. But when you work with different taxa, people ask different sorts of questions. So when you do it on lizards, you can't sort of necessarily have the same variables. There are cost of fleeing effects, habitat selection effects, experimental effects like predator density or sequential attacks, predatory effects, approach speed, directness of approach, whether a predator is looking at you or not, gaze, the size of the predator. Physiological effects remarkably have a rather small impact on lizards. In fishes, we did a meta-analysis and found that shoaling behavior had a relatively big effect. Body size had a big effect. Longevity had a big effect. Negative, longer lived species tolerated closer approaches. Trophic level had an effect, environment, but not group size. So when you look sort of collectively at fishes, you don't find that overall effect. I can't remember if we pulled out shoaling and non-shoaling for this thing, but overall, you can sort of see that the effect sizes, include 0. So that's great. Big species in general may be less tolerant to people, but tolerance requires studying in its own right. And we know that there are some big species that you can get very close to, whale sharks, Australian pelicans, some other things. What's going on with that? So Diego Samia and I and some others sort of said, okay, well, let's capitalize on the fact that people conduct flight initiation distance studies near people and away from people, in cities and in suburban and rural areas, in parks and in areas. And let's define each of these types of areas as a contrast. And let's look for the difference in the same study where someone said, I've looked at, grackles in College Station and out, in the country. And let's calculate these effect sizes. And we're going to call that tolerance. And what we found was that tolerance also is an economic decision, that it varies. The type of contrast has the largest effect on the magnitude of the contrast. Rural versus urban has the largest effect. And that's interesting. There are a number of reasons for that potentially. We can talk about those. But body size had the second largest effect. Wasn't a big effect, but body size had the second largest effect on tolerance. So this sort of changes how you think about a management recommendation. It's not the big species that maybe you have to worry about, because the big species will either habituate or become tolerant to humans. Maybe it's the smaller species you have to worry about. Now, in urban areas and in rural, when you urbanize, of course, urbanization may lead to a filter where you lose species. So really, these are species that are found in both of these environments. And we need to sort of ask questions about, well, why can some species not tolerate humans enough to be able to study their tolerance? But nonetheless, it sort of changes the question around and potentially the recommendation around. Australian ibises are called bin chickens, in Sydney and in Australia, because they come in, they're pests. These are rather large birds that come up and steal food from you in urban areas. They're quite happy in non-urban areas not doing that. But nonetheless, what's going on with Australian ibises? What's going on with these other species? You can ask other sorts of questions as well. Before 2001, 9/11, we started a study where we were looking at birds at what I'm going to call Bolsa Chica, which is an ecotourism site. It's a wetland. There are not a lot of wetlands in Southern California. And this is a beautiful wetland with hiking trails and a lot of birds. But Bolsa Chica is sort of divided in some sense by a fence, kind of, and there's active oil pumping sort of across the fence. And there are very few people there because you're not allowed to go there. And then a little further up the coast, there's another wetland, Seal Beach, which is where the US Navy stores its arms and nukes. And no one's allowed to go there, but they let us go until 2001, in which case we were thrown out. But at the end of the day, if you count the people at these areas, there are very few people in the fenced part of Bolsa Chica wetland, and there are very few people a couple miles up the road, at Seal Beach. And there are a lot of people in the ecotourist area. And then you sort of say, well, let's ask the birds what they think about this. And for a variety of different birds, what we found was the same pattern, which was at Bolsa Chica, where the tourists are, they tolerated closer approach than even across the other side of a fence. Now, were these the same individuals? We don't know. Were individuals assorting themselves according to their relative tolerance for disturbance? Possibly. These are questions that need to be asked, but it's a way at least of asking these sorts of questions. We've done the same thing with spearfishing in fishes and asked how close can you get to fishes in speared areas and in marine protected areas. And we've sort of gotten insights that these marine protected areas are leaky because the fishes were more scared than they should have been, which is interesting. So, fences, may afford some degree of protection. Some birds are more wary when more people approach them. So I teach this field biology class. We go all over the place. And, this year, this group wanted to ask questions about, does the number of people influence the approach, the flight initiation distance? And it turns out when one person walks towards a bird, you can get pretty close to it. And then if you have two people, they can be in a row or they can be side by side approaching, in this case, crimson rosellas, and leads to a very different pattern. Animals generally flush early and avoid the rush, something I've referred to as the fear hypothesis, which means that if you're going to use flight initiation distance to develop setback zones or areas that you want to sort of keep people away from animals, so as not to disturb them, you probably want to make them on the big side. And you can use FID data to sort of customize those based on the species you're interested. But you wouldn't want it to be the minimum flight initiation distance or the maximum. You might want it to be a little bigger than that. But nonetheless, different species tolerate approaches from different distances. And this may vary geographically as well, as we've seen in cities and out of cities. So what are the implications of this? I think, well, as I said, the FID studies that I started really have created an industry of people going around and scaring birds all over the world and other species. And this has been used to ask all sorts of interesting questions about life history trade-offs and risk-taking. It's also been useful in creating databases of flight initiation distance used to potentially design setback zones. Larger birds may be initially vulnerable to human disturbance, but maybe because if you're big, you are also paying a cost to fleeing. There's selection for them to be to sort of habituate, and really it would be habituate, change their behavior when they realize that people are benign. We've done some individual-based modeling with this idea. Large birds, which are more easily disturbed without building in the habituation, have lower expected fitness than smaller birds. But that if you build the habituation in, which we didn't in this individual-based model, that might change things. And again, not all species habituate, not all species have tolerance. But large species that can coexist with humans may end up tolerating them. So future research really should try to parameterize models with real birds, apply these to real problems. We should do more studies trying to understand filtering and tolerance processes, which could reflect differential settlement of individuals with different tolerances, could reflect actual natural selection, meaning species that aren't tolerant die, or could reflect processes of habituation. Noise is everywhere, and we're a really noisy species. I guess coquis are noisy as well, but we've put noise all over the place. Noise has been recognized as something that can mask biologically important signals and drive changes in signal structure. Birds in cities sing at louder. These are Lombard effects. There's been shifts both above and below sound, both in nature and in cities. Cities are natural, but in the wildlands and in cities for various species, noise can create physiological stress. It can change population distributions if animals are trying to avoid noise. And it can also directly harm animals. I mean, the hypothesis about marine mammal strandings following naval sonar tests are just that. So we developed something called a distracted prey hypothesis. And the idea is that any stimulus an animal can perceive is capable of distracting it by reallocating part of its finite attention and thus preventing it from responding to an approaching threat. Attention, which all organisms have, is finite. All animals have. I haven't determined whether plants have it yet, but we were trying to distract sensitive plants a couple months ago and are about to submit a paper. We weren't able to distract them, but we were able to confuse them. But nonetheless, attention is a finite process. You have a certain amount of attention, and if someone stands behind me taking off their clothes, you're probably not paying attention to what I'm doing. And that's a telling example because that's a different modality. So not only can stimuli in the same modality compromise attention, but stimuli in other modalities could as well. So birds, mammals, reptiles, and vertebrates all use attentional processes, cognitive processes, to focus on relevant stimuli that they need to get from the environment. So hermit crabs, terrestrial Caribbean hermit crabs, are a pretty good model system to study this. So instead of looking at flight initiation distance, we looked at something we defined as hiding initiation distance, how close you could walk towards a crab before it would pull into its shell. And I have to say, I felt really bad doing this experiment because this was in the Virgin Islands, and these crabs would get out of the water and they would like climb up these hills, and it's really steep. And then we would scare them and they'd like roll down. I'm like, no, that's so mean. Anyway, so we sort of did a multimodal experiment where we played back different modalities or exposed them to different modalities. We did silence versus boat motor noise. We had a walking person and we created a silent approach to scare him. And then we did the disco party boat experiment, which was noise versus noise plus a strobe to sort of add modalities, and just with a walking person. Turns out that crabs can be approached more closely when boat noise is broadcast, meaning that something about boat noise seems to distract them. It's not just a function of us stomping along the ground and then feeling our vibrations. We took some sort of an inflatable float, and then we put a Clash t-shirt on it, and we sort of vibration free scared them with the Clash t-shirt, and the same result was found. So it wasn't an artifact of us walking towards them. Turns out the addition of an extra distracting stimuli enhances this distraction. So the disco party boat, strobes and boat noise disturbed them even more, distracted them even more. This was one of those field biology projects that then one of the students was working with me, and he was working in a lab, a psychology lab, and this led to a multi-year collaboration with my colleague at UCLA, where he still has hermit crabs, where he ended up setting up a hermit crab lab and doing all sorts of things. And I'll tell you, the sordid thing about terrestrial Caribbean hermit crabs is the whole pet trade, they're all wild caught. They don't breed in captivity. So it's sort of a lose-lose situation. But nonetheless, we ended up replicating all of these results and asking other sorts of questions. And he's asking all sorts of other questions now as well. So hermit crabs, who knew? Ecotourists, I like going to places and looking at things. And I'm going to preface this with, just because we can document something doesn't mean there's a demographic effect, but there could be. So, the question is, we go and we take pictures of animals, and we bring flashes and, blind animals with our flashes to take pictures of them. And, basically, do camera sounds scare animals? So we did a playback, a multimodal playback to anoles in the Virgin Islands, also silence, and we're looking at change in display rate, so they show their dewlap. And banana quits are a bird that sort of sings in the background all the time. They kind of make you go crazy because they're singing all day long, and they actually increase their display rate. This led to a whole research project that actually led to an NSF grant that I'm have right now, thinking about safety cues. But I'll come back to this in a moment. So if anything, anoles hearing banana quits display more, because if the banana quit's happy, maybe there's no predator around. Turns out if anoles hear a kestrel, they suppress their display rate. They get still. So then we sort of said, okay, well, great. Let's use a flash. Let's use a shutter, and let's use the shutter plus the flash. And I thought going into this that flash, because anoles are so visually oriented, would disturb them. But it turns out the sound did, in terms of decreasing. Granted, it's a small effect, but in terms of significantly decreasing the effect, which wasn't really that enhanced. It was slightly enhanced, but not significantly so in the multimodal domain. So it really seems to be the sound, not the flash, that was kind of alarming them. So take only pictures, leave only fear. I don't know. We've got something that sort of shows that people pointing marmots don't like cameras pointed at them either. But there are benefits from ecotourism. There are benefits from connecting with nature, and a lot of habitat is preserved because people respect nature. So all of these problems are socio-ecological systems problems, and I think we need to think about most of our problems, big problems we face in the world, as SES problems. Nonetheless, the biology is an important part of understanding that, I think, and bring something to the table. What about habituation? It's been studied for years and years and years and years, mostly in the lab, mostly on poor chickens and rats and pigeons, or pigeons and rats. Well, habituation, as we know, is a decline in responsiveness to a stimulus, benign stimulus, with repeated exposure. But not all animals habituate, and another process is a process called sensitization, where you get enhanced responsiveness to a stimulus with repeated exposure. Are animals habituating to people? Are they sensitizing to people? How do we understand this? And can we understand the evolution of it? So under what conditions do animals habituate? Under what conditions do they sensitize? So turns out that we can sort of use these ideas and ask a variety of different questions. And the first one I want to talk about is with dik-diks in Kenya, and sort of asking about, does living with people or having ecotourism where a lot of people are around potentially impair survival? So dik-diks have about 36 species of predators. They're a monogamous ungulate. They're about this big. They sit with their husband or wife, and they quiver and they just shake because they know everything out there is going to kill them, because it does. And risk assessment is essential for these guys. So it turns out that many species respond to the sounds of their predators and take evasive action. So we broadcast jackal calls and birdsong. Birdsong, benign stimulus, jackal calls, potential important predator. And we did so close to human habitation and far from human habitation. So this was based at the Impala Research Station in Kenya. So there's buildings, people. Then we also included human habitation, transient bombas that the ranchers used in that area. Bombas are sort of temporary cattle camp. And this is sort of interesting because I think there's sort of an assumption that if you habituate animals to people, they may become dumb and therefore habituate to predators. But really, that's a question that is about categorization. And what we found was that the unhabituated dictycs, the ones far from people, did not discriminate between birdsong and jackal calls, but the ones that were close to people, where they saw people, a lot, did in terms of nose twitching, in terms of foraging, and in terms of vigilance, which is super interesting. So it's sort of, and I'll just sort of add another thing. We did multiple studies with dictycs. Another study was playing aerial predators. So dictycs have this prehensile nose. And when we played back the jackal sounds, they started sniffing. When we played back the aerial predator sounds, they looked up. Dictycs are smart. Predation makes you smart. But at the end of the day, maybe ecotourists in more pristine places are more likely to disturb animals. The way we did this was we were driving around, we would find a dictyc, we'd turn off the engine, slow to a halt, do a playback, from the safety of a car. There were lions in the area. When we did this at places far from people where they weren't exposed to people, the dictycs were alert all the time. We were getting a ceiling effect. We couldn't get a response because they were paying attention to us. So, the idea of zoning areas and having true areas where people don't go, may be really important in terms of thinking about how to maintain pristine behaviors, because we have an effect. You can't, observe an animal without changing its behavior to some extent, particularly in pristine places. Turns out that I took the question to Colorado and asked this with mule deer. Same thing, except in this case, mule deer near humans discriminate marmot alarm calls from sparrows. Turns out that deer listen to marmots, but only around humans, at least compared to sparrows. But far from humans, again, half a kilometer, they don't make that discrimination. We would walk up to the deer and they would be freaked out and be looking at us, and they weren't able to make that discrimination. So I think that, is 0.5 kilometers is sort of a magic number. Kind of works for white-crowned sparrows too. What is it about 0.5 kilometers? You would think it would be scaled to home range size that a species maintains or something like that, or territory size, but 3 very different species. 0.5 kilometers seems to come out as a repeating number. More work needs to be done with this and hone in on what I'll call the spatial ecology of fear. In Los Angeles, there's the Santa Monica Pier, and if you walk towards crazy Venice, a lot of people. But if you walk towards Topanga and Malibu, walk north, people sort of go down. And it turns out that flight initiation distance goes up when people are going down, and where a lot of people are, there isn't really a difference. But the point is that there are a lot of tourists around the Santa Monica Pier. So asking questions about the spatial ecology of fear, I think, is something that we need much more of. But not all species habituate. So we looked at a variety of birds in chaparral in coastal California. And while wetlands are very limited, chaparral's not that limited. There's a lot of chaparral, which is good, but it also burns. And what we found is, if anything, we weren't finding habituation. We were finding that in the high human disturbance areas where we would see lots of people when we were flushing birds, that if anything, this was significantly larger than the low human disturbance areas. So what's going on with that? So, with that result, it's sort of like, well, maybe we can call this the continuous habitat hypothesis. Maybe species living in limited habitats like wetlands, or dropping by in limited habitats like wetlands, and there are not a lot of wetlands in Southern California, have to maybe more likely to habituate because there's been a filtering process. They have to habituate if they're going to tolerate, if they're going to be able to go there, than those living in more contiguous habitats where presumably they can move on. Maybe the filtering hasn't happened in those contiguous habitats. Maybe it's not about habituation. So in any event, I think this hypothesis needs testing. So, habituation, I believe, is potentially a key to predicting how species are going to respond to humans and our stimuli. Not all species habituate. The contiguous habitat hypothesis needs to be tested. More stimuli both in quantity and quality, maybe more disturbing, and that a lack of habituation to our stimuli may sort of enhance our impacts on wildlife. Dik-diks and mule deer are distracted by people and prevent them from making biologically important discriminations. Lizards are potentially distracted by cameras. And then, as I said, the spatial scale of habituation can be stark. Now, prey have more than one predator in many cases. What happens when they lose some? What happens when you're on an island and for many generations and the predators haven't made it to the island? What happens when you're brought into captivity for a captive breeding program? What happens when we kill all the wolves? So these questions I started asking in Australia when I was an Australian postdoctoral fellow, because Australian has a pretty bad record of mammalian extinctions, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I sort of worked with a lab rat of Australian mammals, which is the Tamar wallaby. It's a macropodid marsupial, about the size of a cat. They're found in the wild, but they've had massive range changes and extinctions in the wild, and they adapt well in captivity. And I worked with them both in captivity and in the wild. But they evolved with a rich history of predators. But it really was the introduction of cats and foxes by Europeans that led to the demise of many species of Australian mammals. So I capitalized on the idea that we could look at tamars, also kangaroos, at locations that had different histories of exposure to people. Kangaroo Island was a place with no mammalian predators for 9,500 years off Adelaide, South Australia. People went extinct there. Titani Nature Reserve was in the wheat belt of Western Australia, and that was the fragment of Tamar wallabies that survived somehow the onslaught of cats and foxes. We don't know why. We worked on Garden Island, which is a naval base, was their sub base. The commandant's secretary said when I went to say hello to her one day and tell her what we were finding, because she was the one who got us permission to be there because she liked the tamars. No one else answered our requests. She said, "Oh, I'm glad you came in. Look out the window. That's a Los Angeles class sub. They have guns. Don't go near the wharf." One of our big ones. But we worked all night and then we would see these subs in the day. It was pretty cool, actually. And then I worked in New Zealand, where at the time, about 130 years before, the governor, New Zealand's a place kind of like Hawaii with not a lot of native mammals, but a lot of mammals were introduced there and have caused all sorts of problems. And the governor wanted mammals and he brought over, among other things, Tamar wallabies. And the Kiwis were trying to get rid of them at the time. But there was a population that really lived in suburbia with no predators for 130 years. So with this sort of matrix, we can begin looking for what happens when animals lose their predators. We looked at a bunch of things. One thing I'll talk about today is the idea of what we call group size effects, how animals change their anti-predator vigilance as a function of group size. So if you're surfing alone, as I like to say, you should be pretty vigilant for sharks. And if you're surfing, with one other person, just by dilution alone, each of you has half the probability of being killed by a shark. 3 people, each of you has a third of the probability than if you're surfing alone, et cetera. Importantly, this is a nonlinear relationship and it goes down pretty quickly. And that if that's translated to things like anti-predator vigilance, you expect to see changes in time allocation to vigilance. So let's get back to multiple predators. The presence of a single predator, the multi-predator hypothesis states that says that the presence of a single predator will maintain pleiotropic or otherwise linked anti-predator behavior. And when I sort of came up with this idea, I was thinking about the ghosts of predators past idea, Bobby Pekarsky's idea about, when anti-predator behavior just sticks around. I was thinking about pleiotropic hypothesis, John Byers and Dick Koss have been talking about. And I was thinking about functional integration. Vigilance isn't vigilance isn't vigilance. You could have no predators, but you still got to look for your conspecifics. You got to look for foods. You're still going to be vigilant. Nonetheless, the multi-predator hypothesis is one of many hypotheses to explain what happens when you lose predators, as I'll talk about in a moment. But it's an ultimate hypothesis about why we see persistence. Any predator behavior shouldn't evolve independently. You need to be able to respond to aerial predators and terrestrial predators. If you're really good at responding to eagles and you're not good responding to coyotes, you're probably not going to leave offspring. So your fitness is probably going to be lower than someone who can respond to both of them. You need to respond when you're young as well as older. So maybe onto genetic things. If you're a mule deer, you're going to be cryptic and immobile early in life. But you could be cryptic with the spots, but if you bounce around like you have a brainworm, you're probably not going to make it through the day. So we expect there to be selection to create suites, syndromes of behavior. So, any predator behavior genomically probably should be linked, and selection should maintain these linkages. Regardless, we can think about this without thinking about the genome, thinking about syndromes, and selection should maintain these syndromes if there's any benefit from doing so. In other words, as long as there's some predators, assuming there isn't a vastly different cost of responding to one predator versus another. So it makes a key prediction. Animals living with some predators will maintain any predator behavior, while those living without predators will lose it. So if we look at the Tamar wallabies, we find that isolation from predators in predator-free New Zealand led to the loss of group size effects. This is foraging, this is vigilance, where we see group size effects at all of these other locations. So 130 years, 50 to 70 generations was sufficient time to lose any predator behavior. There's been other support. California ground squirrels retain the ability to respond to poisonous snakes, both behaviorally and physiologically, even in locations where they haven't lived with poisonous snakes for a long time. Pronghorn still run really fast, despite the extinction of their cursorial predators, thousands of years ago. Marmots respond to the sight, the sound, the smell of extinct wolves. Joel Berger's ungulate work shows that it's not simply the initial response. Learning can be selected too. And there's a rapid recovery. The ungulates learn very quickly once they experience a predator, even in areas, once they experience predation of their young, even in areas where there haven't been predators for a long time, to respond to them. Mosquito fish respond to predator archetypes. Archetypes are similarities across species. And I started a survey a while ago where I was looking at papers that cited the multi-predator hypothesis. And it turns out that a lot of them found at least some support for it. This requires a formal meta-analysis. We started one and then stopped it. Now I'm involved in another one, which includes testing this among other hypotheses. So it needs more testing. What are its limits? It implies the costs of responding without a predator are similar to all predators. That's unlikely. It does make you think about the loss of different sorts of predators. Is it, can any loss of any predator maintain this, or similar sorts of predators from geographic locations at which they attack or not? What about sit and wait versus pursuit? Is the time course of loss really rapid? And that's really important, because if you're bringing animals into captivity because you want to start a captive breeding program, or because everything's being eaten to extinction outside a fence, which is a thing I'll talk about in a moment, you can lose any predator behavior. You can lose skills that are necessary for survival. Does the mechanism matter? Is it the same for traits that involve more learning versus, that are innate in the sense that they're, they behave perfectly the first time they encounter various stimuli? And how important are these archetypes, similarities, trait similarities between predators and maintaining these things? And ultimately, can we identify a quantitative genetic signature? And can we prospect for the genes that, might be linked or not? Is linkage really the mechanism of this? So I think it's a predictable and testable hypothesis that has consequences for how we manage populations for conservation in some cases. And it seems to be the loss of all, but not some predators, that increases species vulnerability. So Alex Carthy was postdocing and came and visited my lab for a while, and we started brainstorming. She's like, but it's not just the multi-predator hypothesis, it's the predator archetype hypothesis. There are, about 12 different hypotheses that can explain what happens. And we started brainstorming this, and then she goes away and then comes back with what was the beginning of a subway map. Not only is she brilliant, but she makes brilliant graphics. And this is the subway map of fear. And basically, we're interested in what happens with evolutionary experience, and ecological experience, evolutionary experience, and what that mechanism could be in terms of allowing animals to respond to discriminate various cues. And this thing continues on the next page. And then it, basically, what we're trying to do now is a meta-analysis to try to understand which of these has the relatively biggest effects: ecological isolation, evolutionary isolation, a combination of them, and what might the mechanisms be explaining this, because we suspect this leads to very different conservation prognosis. If you're not if you're just isolated for a generation, you can take animals and put them back out and they're probably going to be okay. If you have lived in a place with other predators and you bring them into captivity, you probably can put them out and they'll be okay. If you're taking animals from offshore islands and putting them into a predator, rich mainland scenario, that could lead to problems. And that's what we're currently working on with a current series of ARC grants and in Australia, where it's sort of motivated by this idea that Australia has the world's worst record of recent mammalian extinctions. 27 mammal species, based on how you can argue about what a species is in this case, in some cases, but 27 mammals have gone extinct since European settlement in 1788. This is the worst on Earth. 33% of the mammals that have gone extinct in Australia. Foxes and cats kill an estimated 75 million native animals each night. It's foxes and cats that drove these things extinct. Feral cats kill between 169 and 508 million birds per year alone. There's just a similar sort of study that just came out a couple of weeks ago on foxes. So a brilliant conservation scientist, I think she's one of the smartest people on earth in terms of innovative conservation stuff, Catherine Mosby, calls me one day and says, well, you've been doing all this stuff with predator training. And she calls me, she emails me, and we get involved in a long email discussion. And she's like, I don't think predator training works. Like, it can work. And she's like, I don't think it works. I tried it and it didn't work. I think what you have to do is you have to take animals and you have to throw them in with predators, and you have to let selection sort them out. And then you take the survivors and you reintroduce those. And I said, I think that's unethical. And then we got into a large month-long discussion. And at the end of it, it's like, that was really fun. And she's like, yeah, I'm thinking of writing a proposal. When you want to be part of it, I'm like, yeah, I do. And we sort of came up with this idea of in situ predator training. And this isn't for everybody, but it works in some contexts. I teach an ecological ethics class. I care deeply about ethics and welfare. But the idea is, if you expose animals to low densities of predators over a long period of time, animals can learn, and there's selection. And maybe we're agnostic about the mechanism initially, but if it works and animals do better dealing with predators, then maybe you can release them outside the fence. And I say outside the fence because one of the major conservation strategies in Australia now is creating fenced reserves. And Catherine and her husband developed cat-proof fencing and fox-proof fencing, which involved doing all sorts of nasty things to foxes and cats to make sure they couldn't get across the fence. But at the end of the day, they also established something called arid recovery, which is a 123 square kilometer reserve with fox and cat-proof fence on the outside. And it's divided into a series of large paddocks. So when I sort of imagined you take your endangered wallaby or whatever, and you throw in predators with it, I was thinking, in a rather small space. And context is everything. So if you have one cat in 36 square kilometers, that's different than having one cat in a small room or even a big room, in terms of giving the animals a fighting chance, and importantly, giving them a chance to learn. So it's in the arid zone in South Australia. And we've been doing a number of studies there. Feral cats are the predators we're most concerned about. Burrowing bedongs are one of the species we're working with, and greater bilbies are another one we've worked a lot with. We're extending this to hopping mice and stick nest rats and other things. Quolls are something that have created all sorts of problems for us, but we're trying to make lemonade out of lemons. These are species they're bringing back to recover, basically. And what they discovered early on was bedongs were driven extinct on mainland Australia and survived on some Western Australia offshore islands. And the bedongs were brought back, put in the fence, and this is an endangered species. And in no time, there were thousands of them. thousands, to the point where they were eating all the vegetation, which is what happens when you're an herbivore without predators. Greater bilbies populations were drastically reduced in the mainland. They're sort of survive a little bit in Northwest Australia in places where populations aren't that high. Dingoes can be a hero because dingoes eat cats and certainly eat foxes. So dingoes can be part of maintaining a healthy ecosystem for prey. In any event, we did a number of questions, and cats kill them. We know cats kill them. So we started putting in cats, one cat initially, with bedungs and bilbies. And what we found was that if you start looking at cat versus control paddocks, we found them. They weren't going extinct over time. We also found, the bilbies weren't going extinct over time. Bedungs and bilbies have been reproducing in the presence of cats. So it wasn't just the same individuals were there, the populations were growing. Bedungs and bilbies can coexist with cats. I mean, we were really concerned about this going into it, in a whole sense of bunch of controls to say, when do we, get the cats out of there? But if you have too many cats, then there are problems. So it sort of takes this question of can you live with something that drove you extinct, and it makes it explicitly an ecological question. What's the coexistence threshold? Bedungs have become more wary over time when living with cats. We came up with a way to look at sort of nocturnal flight initiation distance, it's really hard to work at night. I have to say I don't like working at night. You can't see anything, you don't know what's going on around you. But over time, over a year and a half, the cat ones became significantly more wary than the control bedungs. Bedungs have learned to discriminate cat models after living with cats. So if you look at no cats and you look at how they respond to a control or bad taxidermy, or other controls, we find that there's really no difference without cats in terms of high vigilance. There's a little bit of difference between cat and control, but it gets much bigger over here. And it's significantly larger than non-predatory things like rabbits. So they're learning. That's interesting. I mean, that's good. Maybe there's selection, maybe there's learning. We found that bilby survival was enhanced by living with cats. So we translocated animals from a place living with cats and a control population to a place where there were cats already established, and we followed them as long as our radio collars, which we taped onto their tails, could work. And that was about 40 days. And we found that the predator-exposed ones survived significantly longer than did the non-predator exposed ones. So this is all within the control of arid recovery. Our goal is to sort of bring these up but then introduce them outside the fence and see how that can work. And we've been having problems with partners, but we've had partners for a long time, but the partners haven't been able to get the cat and fox populations down to a point where we think we could see a result, because we don't want to just put animals out and have them all die. We want to be able to look at the dynamics of this. Interestingly, there was no effect of bedung survival at higher low cat densities, which was itself interesting. So that was a lot, and it really was designed to sort of get you thinking about ways you can think about predation, one topic in behavior, and then begin thinking in different ways how this might be useful for conservation and management related questions. And I can talk about all sorts of other things as well, but I can't talk about everything. So I think that ultimately in conservation behavior, we need to develop mechanistic models to predict how animals will respond to humans. I think flight initiation distance is a useful metric to gain insight into how animals perceive risk. I think that anthropogenic stimuli can distract animals and enhance vulnerability to predators. And it turns out that once we sort of came up with a distracted prey hypothesis, many other people are now evaluating that in other sorts of contexts, ship noise and fishes and et cetera. So it's not simply, sound is stressful, sound masks communication, but sound also can distract animals from biologically important tasks like assessing predation risk. Not all animals habituate, and We need to understand the conditions of habituation versus sensitization. This is a full employment scheme for, people who want to look at a variety of systems and understand the evolution of these traits. The presence of any predator may maintain any predator behavior, even for extinct predators, multi-predator hypothesis. But there are other hypotheses out there too. And if we ever get this meta-analysis done, we'll be able to sort of look at the relative evidence in support of these hypotheses. We may be able to inculcate fear into fearless populations, not simply by training individuals on a one-on-one basis, but by actually for suitable species where we have letting them live with predators at low densities. And I think all of these can be applied to solve conservation problems, but they really all should be presented and evaluated in an adaptive management framework. All of these are hypotheses ripe for testing. They're not answers necessarily, but we have to develop a toolkit. We have to develop a vocabulary before we can go out and test it and evaluate it. And for the right problem in the right context, these might be useful ways and tools to think about things. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to thank again the organizers for inviting me to this really stimulating meeting. And I'm happy to try to answer any questions. And importantly, I'm around all day tomorrow as well. And I'd love to hear what you're doing. And if I can talk, I'll wear a mask. I'm happy to talk about other things as well. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks so much. I wondered if you had looked at fear in the context of like habitat specialists versus generalists, or I guess what your prediction would be about habitat specialists and their ability to tolerate humans or other novel predators.
Yeah, it's a really good question. At some level, both chaparral birds and wetland birds are both habitat specialists, but it's different sort of habitat. There's a large sort of cognitive literature. Daniel Soul thinks about foraging innovations, which he defines as, if you look at all of, because birdos like publish all sorts of interesting notes, it's cool. So you count how many notes have been published about foraging innovations, which is like someone is able to publish something saying, oh, in this species, I saw them eating this or doing this, and has used that as a measure of sort of plasticity. So really, and then thought about that in urbanization and extinction risk, et cetera. I mean, his research program's rich, and I'm not going to try to summarize it now, but I think he's thinking about plasticity in a way that a specialist or a generalist, there might be selection for plasticity. So it's probably more about phenotypic plasticity, or a profitable way of thinking about this might be in terms of, what drivers of phenotypic plasticity. So my path diagram would be habitat specialist leads to selects for certain cognitive abilities that have multiple functions and consequences. But it's a good question.
That was great. I really enjoyed that. I have a comment, and then I have that we can talk about later, hopefully, and then a question. The comment is an old friend and colleague, Russ Greenberg, and I used to talk a lot about neophobia. Yep. And I kept on thinking about, well, how is this different than neophobia and, fear of novel things? And he would take, rubber duckies and all kinds of odd things that we don't need to talk about, that he would, put it into different species and measure that neophobia. And I'm thinking about that, but let's talk about that later. I have a different question, which has to do with the physiological underpinnings of a lot of these things that we know a lot about. Everything from host-parasite interactions like Toxoplasma gondii, which is all geared towards sort of, reducing this fear response to allow the parasite itself to persist through dopamine and other type of endocrine mechanisms, to the core stress response, which is really interesting and varies across multiple species. There's intraspecific differentiation there. There's all kinds of interesting things that provide sort of more of a mechanistic basis for what you're talking about in a lot of species. And I'm wondering, to what degree have you thought about all these various things that occur in nature naturally that provide a lot of other adaptive
Yeah.
mechanisms, explanations.
So mechanisms are mechanisms are mechanisms. So a mechanism for, an ecologist might be behavior. A mechanism for a behavior person might be a glucocorticoid response. A mechanism for a glucocorticoid expert might be receptor densities or, whatever, right? So you can always tunnel down more and more. And that's fine. But yes, I do. With the beauty and the peril of these big flight initiation distance databases this is what I call the best of smash and grab biology. You scare an animal, you move on, and you do someone else. These are typically not individually marked animals. Maria Coretti, who studies burrowing owls in Argentina, but is based in, I think, in Spain, has individually marked animals that she looks at flight initiation distance and can ask other levels of questions. We do the same thing with yellow-bellied marmots, where we are looking at endocrine responses and things like that. Are stressy animals, what are the syndromes, how are quart and other things associated, with flight initiation distance. We're not sampling animals on sort of the same day that we're, getting their FIDs, but we can sort of build complex statistical models and begin to ask those questions. We can follow individuals and ask questions about habituation. So I think that, as I said, mechanisms. Going lower can give us more insights. Esteban Fernandez-Urisic thinks about vision a lot and looks at bird vision and looks at where foveas are and how animals are actually seeing. And in a lot of these studies, we assume incorrectly that when an animal turns its head, it sees you. Some animals don't have heads necks to turn, but nonetheless, and that you can use that as an indication of something. And he sort of is showing that animals are actually tracking predators long before they have a behavioral response to them. I don't think that necessarily discounts the ability to sort of look at differences among individuals, but it does complexify things in interesting ways. Understanding, Esteban and a bunch of other people are interested in reducing bird strikes on aircraft and vehicle strikes on ungulates and birds. And there are interesting questions about how animals are processing, whether they see things far away, and then how they what are the mechanisms by which they're estimating time to impact. And it seems that the emerging insights seem to be that we're in a mismatch zone now, where planes are traveling much faster than animals have evolved to sort of detect approaching. And a strategy that people are trying is to make planes or other things more visible by figuring out what they can perceive and then designing lights or other things that they can see. So maybe they detect them at a greater distance and can flee at a greater distance. So I think that mechanisms are going to be important, and physiological and visual and cognitive mechanisms are going to be really important in coming up with effective management. I think that I didn't show you the other diagram in this paper that Allison and Oded and I wrote, thinking about approach and withdrawal type responses or traction or repulsion. But there, it really is a decision support tool and a bifurcating tree. Can animals perceive the stimuli that you're using to attract them or repel them? That's a very mechanistic question. You have to understand the animal's Umwelt, and you can manipulate those, and you can try to make things more detectable. So I think you're spot on. I think we need to think mechanisms, because mechanisms are levers. Does that answer your question?
Any more questions for Dan?
It'll record it on. Oh, yeah.
So I was a bit curious if there are any sort of overlaps between sort of human fear responses and some of the studies that you're doing, because I guess in the sense that we are much more urbanized, and I'm sure there's a lot of mechanistic cognitive stuff, but would there be any, I don't know, insight that could be gained from
Advertisement, read my book, The Nature of Fear. That's sort of what can we learn from looking at anti-predator behavior about our own fear responses. What are the lessons of anti-predator behavior? I mean, the same glucocorticoid response, a marmot may have if it has a near miss with a fox is the same thing, you know, you're going to have when you have a near miss with a car accident or something like that, or someone tries to mug you or kill you. You know, so these are conserved mechanisms that lead to very similar things. Joseph Ledoux is a pioneer in sort of anxiety and stress, and for years worked with, he's at NYU, for years worked with rats and came up with all these great ideas looking at anxiety and whatever. He wrote a book a couple of years ago called Anxious, and he sort of basically threw out everything and said, no, I now don't believe this. Humans are unique. We're the only ones that have anxiety. We're the only ones that have this. I disagree completely. I think these are very conserved, elemental responses. And I think that when you start putting this into a broader context of thinking fast or slow, these fight or flight responses, you know, are things that politicians sort of tweak with us to get elected. You always get elected based on fear. You know, they're coming over the border after you. They're invading our country. You know, things like that. Fear sells. And the way to counter that, the way to inoculate yourself against that is slow down your decision process and get away from that fear circuit, and then, you know, use all evidence to evaluate what's going on. So I think there's many insights for human behavior. There's also a huge literature on, really interesting literature on what uniquely, you know, we find scary. That is a little, you know, because of humans, we can ask these questions and study these things. But you know, we still do respond to spiders. I don't know what parents would let their kids do this, but you know, there's all these developmental psychology experiments, you know, where kids, infants, are exposed to spider-like objects and things like that, or lines or whatever, and you know, they would perceive them the same way a little primate would perceive them in some way. So we are when in evolutionary medicine, I like to sort of, you know, think about looking left, right? That to understand who we are, we need to understand our ancestors, and our ancestors aren't just, you know, chimpanzees and bonobos and orangs and gibbons. Our ancestors go all the way back, and you know, these glucocorticoid responses go all the way back. So we can learn a lot.
Hey, I think it's me. Hi. So I was wondering, flight initiation, what's it called?
FID, flight initiation distance. Some people call it FID.
FID.
I don't call it FID. I call it flight initiation distance.
Is this, I'm sure it is. Is this ever used as a proxy for like habitat degradation? And I guess, how do you see, you know, for example, if birds are not as easily scared in certain areas, is that considered worse habitat always? Or how do you see that?
I wouldn't use it as a metric of habitat degradation as opposed to sort of anthropogenic impact in some way.
I guess, yeah.
Right. So you can have a degraded habitat that, you know, you can have a poisoned habitat that doesn't have people in it, like most Superfund sites.
Yeah. So do you see that differently in like pristine areas versus like metro parks or something like that?
Yeah,
And-
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, you know,
You kind of have to
Anders
take what you
Moeller,
can get.
until the invasion of Ukraine, and Tim Mousseau had a huge program going on at Chernobyl, and then also, you know, at Fukushima. But Chernobyl is interesting because, you know, no one goes to those forests, so they've been documenting increases in numbers of species and, you know, populations, but they've been finding mutations and genetic effects of, you know, the Chernobyl meltdown, but also, you know, that you've got sort of more wild animals again. So, yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay, I think that's going to be it. We're going to take another 10-minute break and come back with all of our speakers for a panel in about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much.